Hey, it's Mike here, and today, behavior change. In particular, what keeps us from changing our habits, from making the changes that we want to make, which for many people is going vegan. Keep trying to go vegan, but every time I just get stranded on a desert island. I've been studying behavior change in my master's in public health, and I realized there's a lot of parallels with what's going on in those studies and with the process of going vegan or even going on a healthier vegan diet. And the factors that lead somebody to change their behavior or not change their behavior have been well studied and are very practical in this case. And this information is, of course, not just useful to people that are trying to go vegan. It's useful for everybody in everyone's life trying to do general things. And lastly, we are going to look at one psychiatrist's behavior hack for overcoming bad habits, which I'm excited about. So let's get started. I want to start by introducing one school of thought around behavior, which I think is a good starting point for zooming out and looking at what forms our own decisions and our own behavior, and that is the health behavior model. It's classically used to look at the health behaviors of a population, figure out why they're making stupid decisions, but it can also be applied to individuals. For example, why did Norm just decide to have unprotected relations with two traveling gypsy strippers? Now you have that untreatable gonorrhea, Norbert. What's his name, Norm? Whatever. So while it's usually used to explain and predict health behaviors in populations, you can also use it to figure out why people may or may not be going vegan or why you might be having a hard time going vegan. All right, let's just get into it. The health behavior model looks at a few main factors which really focus on people's beliefs and how they form behavior, and the first one of those is perceived barriers. Simply put, these are what you believe are hurdles to keep you from doing the healthy thing. Here's a pretty bad example. I can't give up snorting coke because then I won't feel like I'm on top of the world. Plus, I'm deeply entrenched in a drug ring that gets their supply from mermaids. In a vegan context, these are pretty familiar. They're, I might spend more money on a vegan diet. I might get a protein deficiency. I might lose all my muscle. I might grow man boobs from soy. And these barriers are common myths that end up making about half of the content on my channel. And of course, when you're weighing barriers, you're putting them up against perceived benefits. For example, if I go vegan, I might have more energy, I might reverse a disease, I'm gonna save animals, I'm gonna help the environment, and so forth. Since that one's super simple, albeit important, let's move on to the next one in the health behavior model, which is the perceived threat. Classically, if you're looking at a disease, the perceived threat is a combination between the perceived severity of a disease and the perceived susceptibility to that disease that you might have. Severity is, of course, the chance that the disease will kill you or ruin your life, and the perceived susceptibility is, well, for example, what are your chances of getting black lung? Well, do you work in a coal mine? Susceptible. Now, looking at making the healthy behavior decision of going vegan, you're actually looking at the perceived threat of not making a change, of just staying on the same diet and continuing to eat meat and other animal products. Those threats include artery clogging, carcinogenic foods, hormones in dairy, how 95% of persistent organic pollutants come in the diet through animal fat, etc. In terms of susceptibility, how likely are you to get heart disease or diabetes? Do they run in your family? And so forth. And interestingly, if you were wanting to go vegan for ethical reasons, you're actually looking at the perceived threat in terms of what is your own threat to animals. You are the threat. And back to perceived benefits, that is, of course, saving those animals, and the perceived barriers could be, will I turn into a self-righteous douche monster? Maybe. Still worth it. Now, the last point is perceived self-efficacy, how effective you think you're gonna be in making that health change, and this actually is a pretty powerful one. You know, how effective do you think you will be at going vegan? And if you don't think you're gonna be effective, then you're definitely not gonna try. We miss 100% of the shots that we don't take, though. I learned that from a middle school poster. A really common example here is people who say they can't go vegan because they could never give up cheese. That comes straight down to their own belief in their abilities, and therefore they're not even gonna try. So to be practical here, you have to figure out what your weak points are and how to overcome them. Maybe you think you can go vegan because you don't really know how to cook, so you got to look for the laziest, easiest recipes. Maybe get an Instant Pot or other programmable pressure cooker, so you just have to chop and press on. And going back to all the perceived barriers and threats and so forth, looking at oneself, you have to think, what changes or emphases can you make to shift your behavior. And so you can think, oh, I have these perceived barriers. What can I do about those? Maybe you need to put more emphasis on the benefits to level out the equation. So to amplify those benefits, maybe you want to look at some case studies of people who went vegan and reversed their diseases, or my 10 transformations on a vegan diet video, super inspirational. And just in case you want to have fun with this on your own, I've made a document that you can download in the description where you can fill out your own perceived barriers and threats and so forth, and then hopefully tackle them. And I probably have a video about it, maybe not. And my last point on the health behavior model is looking at Dr. Esselstyn's trial, reversing heart disease with patients who have advanced cardiovascular disease and saving dozens of lives. He had an amazing 89% adherence. 89% of people stuck with a dietary intervention. And we can look at it like this. A lot of those patients had a very high perceived threat of likely dying from their next heart attack. They had already had heart attacks and strokes. They had very advanced cardiovascular disease. And then Dr. Esselstyn came in and really hammered in that perceived benefit of not dying, and therefore any barriers just didn't even matter in the equation. Okay, the health behavior model is great. It's helped fight diseases for decades and so forth, but there is one limitation that is often mentioned, and that is that it doesn't necessarily take into account emotions that well. We are emotional creatures, and whether or not we're gonna make a behavior change is largely dictated by some pretty deep emotions, some that we might not be aware of, and others that we're definitely not going to write down on a spreadsheet made by Mike the Vegan. But I made yeah, that's true. Now for a concept that I think is fascinating, because to change your behavior, you have to make decisions, and it turns out that decisions and emotions are far more intertwined than we tend to think they are. In fact, it appears that decisions are almost entirely driven by emotion, regardless of how much intellectualization goes on in the process. Let's illustrate this with a little story from Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, where he has a patient named Elliot who's a bit peculiar. Elliot was a very intelligent businessman who had his brain tumor removed, and after that, his life sort of fell into shambles after making a series of poor decisions. After diagnosing him, Damasio determined that Elliot sort of didn't have emotions anymore. Here's his bleak description, quote, "He was always controlled, always describing scenes as a dispassionate, uninvolved spectator. Nowhere was there a sense of his own suffering, even though he was the protagonist." Perhaps most interestingly, Elliot had a hard time making simple decisions such as where to park his car. He was now walking us through a tiresome cost-benefit analysis, an endless outlining and fruitless comparison of options and possible consequences. It took enormous discipline to listen to all of this without pounding on the table and telling him to stop. Damasio believes that because emotions are the root of decisions, for Elliot, whose emotions were disconnected from the part of his brain that rationalizes the prefrontal cortex, making a decision as simple as which color pen to use took way too long. Black or blue? Black or blue?
One eternity later.
Blue. No, actually black. Black seems more official. But that could be interpreted as racist. Actually could be racist if I don't use it. This is so frustrating. So the story was to illustrate that deep down, we make decisions based off emotion, no matter how logical we think we're being. You can use numbers, but how you feel about those numbers will be rooted in emotion. In a vacuum, if you're looking at two items, you might go with the cheaper one, not because you like that number more or anything, but because deep down, you have this emotional need to conserve resources. But add some more factors, you might end up buying the more expensive car because of maybe a deep emotional need to have a higher status within the tribe, even though the numbers don't add up, and that's a stupid decision. And don't get me wrong, information can change emotions, but for many, the logic is just an afterthought. With this in mind, I can't help but think of all of the ridiculous explanations, excuses for not going vegan, how plants feel pain, or if we all go vegan, animals will overrun the world, and so forth. Those were never the reasons you started eating meat. It was emotional all along. So while it can be kind of hard to do, you might have to ask yourself, what are the emotional motivators behind your decisions? Or what are the emotional factors that are keeping you from going vegan? And across the board, I feel like the most common one that I've observed is people wanting to not give up their emotional sense of belonging to their tribe, etc. To not be an outcast, which they fear being vegan will result in. And if that's the case, you can think of ways to go vegan and even enrich your social life and be more accepted and so forth. As long as you know what your emotional motivation is, at least you have a chance at tackling it. Now let's get into the final topic, the ever frustrating hardwired habits that we have and how to change them. We try to brute force ourselves into changing habits usually, and it almost never works. We end up eating that junk food, staying up late, or missing the gym again. And that brings me to psychiatrist Judson Brewer, who uses mindfulness to break habits, to break addictions. Here he is on the TED stage.
In my lab, we studied whether mindfulness training could help people quit smoking. They could try to force themselves to quit smoking, and the majority of them had tried this before and failed, on average 6 times. Now, with mindfulness training, we dropped the bit about forcing and instead focused on being curious. See if you can tap into this natural capacity. Just be curiously aware of what's happening in your body and mind in that moment. It will just be another chance to perpetuate one of our endless and exhaustive habit loops, or step out of it.
And he takes a bit of a more unique angle here of saying, engage your curiosity, ask questions about yourself and your state while you are engaged in that bad habit. And that will result in a shift in what your mind is doing and allow you to observe yourself and hopefully break the cycle.
Instead of see text message, compulsively text back, feel a little bit better, notice the urge, get curious, feel the joy of letting go, and repeat.
You might be thinking, mindfulness, that's woo-woo, whatever, never gonna work for me. Well, it's pretty backed by science. Looking to this study that he mentioned in his presentation.
But in one study, we found that mindfulness training was twice as good as gold standard therapy at helping people quit smoking. So it actually works.
A concrete example. Maybe you're trying to go vegan and you discover that a half-eaten cheese wheel is in your hand currently. Observe and ask yourself questions. Be curious about your own cheese binging process. Observe the coagulated mammalian lactations that are enriched with casomorphins that have an opioid effect on your body, and realize it's actually kind of nasty.
And what did they notice? Well, here's an example from one of our smokers. She said, mindful smoking smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck.
In the end, humans are complex creatures, and a video of this length, or any video for that matter, can only take us so far, but at least I hope you found it interesting. To sum it up, whether or not we engage in a healthy behavior changed is a result of various things like perceived barriers and threats and benefits, and whether or not you believe you have the ability, that's self-efficacy. Also, our decisions are pretty much entirely driven by emotion, whether or not we want to believe that. And finally, maybe try tackling some habits with mindfulness. Who knows, could work for you. All right, that's it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe. Let me know what you thought about all of these crazy theories, and I'll see you in the next video.